But I think if you look at the long run, um, of having a nice, simple domain name that's easy to spell, easy to remember, and the benefits that will give you, spending a few $1,000s in a domain to get started, even as a small business, makes a lot of sense.
Have you ever wondered how domains work? That thing you go search online to go to a website. Where did it come from? How was it created? Who truly owns it? All these random things we've probably not even thought of before, we dive into on the podcast today with Andrew, who is an awesome guy, owns podcastguest.com, and is a domain expert. We dive into all of it. So stay tuned and enjoy the next episode in just a few moments on the Finally Marketing That Works podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Finally Marketing That Works podcast. I'm here with a new friend out of beautiful Washington, Andrew. Andrew, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on the show, Mitchell.
Man, so glad to have you. This guy who's talking right now, no, not me, guys, the other guy, Andrew, he runs this website. He does other things too, I'm sure, but he has this site called podcastguest.com. I think there's, what is it, Andrew, over 30,000 people on this podcast guest, or you've helped 30,000 people, I think, connect.
Yeah, we have
What is the number?
over 30,000 users now using the system.
Man, that's crazy. And it's been around for how long?
A little over 5 years at this point.
Man, and so you think about 30,000 people are using this. And of course, I'm one of the users. I've met great people on podcast guests. And it was actually one of my employees that found it because we were like talking about launching the podcast. And when we were talking about it, I was like, who should we get as guests? And they found this random website and they're like, hey, check this one out. And I was kind of blown away because when I was looking at, I feel like fairly high profile people that are on there for like very successful business people or entrepreneurs, all that stuff. And I was like, let's try it. And so we messaged them and people are like, yeah, let's talk. I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And so now I feel like I have these friends all throughout, well, internationally now, because there's some outside of North America that we've had conversations with. So what a great tool that you created, because I think that's probably, at least I was worried about it launching a podcast. Like, how am I going to get in front of people that are going to be open to talking on a podcast? And podcast guests did that exactly. So why did you start it, I guess, in the first place? We'll kind of jump into that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear you're having success with it. I hear that from a lot of people, and it makes me happy. It's great to be able to connect people. So in really the background of the service and the reason I started it is exactly that pain point you're having. So I started a podcast about domain names of all things. Speaking of a small niche,
Oh,
about let's see, I'm up to 354 episodes, so six plus years ago. And after about a year of having guests on the show, I was like, "Man, I've really tapped out my Rolodex. I need to find some new and interesting people to come on this show, and how do I do that?" And so I went out there and looked around, and there are lots of agencies that will help you one-on-one book people for your shows, which are great, but they're expensive, right? Because they're putting a lot of labor into it. And so I thought about, hey, how can I create a platform that connects podcasters with guests that will be free or very inexpensive? And so that's why I ended up creating podcastguests.com. And when it started out very small, there were just a couple hundred of us using it. But as you mentioned, it's now over 30,000 people on the platform.
I don't know if you're allowed to share this or not, because I don't even know if there's a good answer for this. What's the highest profile person that has used it that you know of, or is on podcast guests to volunteer their time as a guest? Do you have any like people would know, go, holy smoke, so and so used to be using it or used to be on
Yeah,
it?
it's hard to say because different people are famous in different worlds,
Sure.
right? We have some former NFL players. We have the president of the Houston Texans. Um, on the entertainment side, this one you'll probably know, at least if you're my age. I don't know if you remember in the late '90s, "Whoop, There It Is," which is the hip hop. It's super popular. Platinum selling. Well, DC Glenn, who's one of the two people in that, is on the platform, and he's in the new Geico commercial that some people might have seen too, where they kind of riff on that. On that song. So, yeah, I mean, there are a wide variety of people, but there's some people on there who I like have no idea are famous, and then they start getting all these invitations. People are like, "Oh, I've read all your books, and I
Mm.
love you. Will you come on my show?" So, yeah, it's really interesting how different people are famous within their niche.
And I feel like I'm the worst person about that stuff. Like, there'll be people say, "Do you know, well, that movie's coming out, it has so and so in it?" And I'll
Yeah,
go, "Who is that?" And they look at me like, are you kidding me? How do you not know
I
them?"
hear
And
you.
and
I
then I
hear
say,
you.
"What else are they in?" That's how I have to do. Like, what else are they? Oh, they're in this movie. Oh, you mean so and so from that movie? Like, okay. So, and do you do anything in addition to having the podcast guests? What's the day to day life look like for Andrew?
Well, that's the domain name side where I started that podcast. So I have a trade publication for the domain name industry. So it's very insider baseball for people like companies like GoDaddy, that offer domain names and people that buy and sell domains. So that's I do that, and then I do podcast guests. And although podcastguests.com doesn't take a lot of time, as it's grown, obviously it takes a little bit more time. And there are a lot more user demands and feature requests and that sort of thing as time goes on. So
Man, so in the domain world, that world is pretty intriguing to me. I just bought a couple domains last night actually, and they're like, 10 bucks, 12 bucks, whatever they end up being. And then I know you got some of the high profile domains that have come out where I remember hearing, I think Facebook bought fb.com for like 30 million or 20 million
yeah,
something.
I feel like it wasn't quite, but it was like 7, 8 million.
Okay.
It was a lot of money. Yeah, a lot of money. Voice.com is the most expensive domain to ever sell that's been publicly announced, and that was $30 million.
Yeah.
There are a lot of domains that sell that we just never hear about due to non-disclosure agreements.
Mm. What's the, you have any, you're allowed to share that the highest profile one you've been in the, like, dealing with or ever had that you've owned and sold?
That's a good question. I think my most valuable domain name is probably dnw.com, which I use for my site. So it's not really something I would sell. But I've helped some people that have acquired domains for, $100,000 or more. And I mean, those types of names sell all the time, all the time. So, oneword.com domain names, if it's a decent word, you're looking at a minimum of six figures at this point. So,
Golly. And of course, .com still the main one people are trying to get all the time, right?
yeah, I would say so. In some countries, people prefer what we call our country code domain name. Like in Germany, that's .de. And I say they prefer it. They usually start with it, but then if they become a global company, they want to have the .com. So.
So since you know domains, this is going to be fun. I actually like this. So where, why, I guess, where did domains originate from? Because why did we get .com? Why is that one the most popular? And why is it that other countries, even though they have their country code ones, why do they want a .com? Like, how did that kind of even just fall into place of having .com?
Well, I mean, if you think back to the 80s when this naming system was created, people didn't know what it was going to become, right? So some of this, I think, well, I know would have been architected differently, or set up differently had people known. But ComNet and org were three of kind of the original ones that came out, and frankly, Com was in some ways an afterthought.
Hmm.
Um, but it really, once companies started using the web in the ways they did, right? E-commerce, a lot of these things that weren't anticipated at the time, it became popular. And the whole point of domain names is, a website has an IP address, but it's just a string of numbers, right? And that's hard to remember. It's hard to remember a phone number. That's why toll-free numbers, you used to have, they convert it to letters for you, right? And so it's the same sort of idea with a domain name. It maps to an IP address, but it's easier for you and me to remember. So podcastguests.com is easy to remember, an IP address wouldn't be. And since the United States was kind of the birthplace of the web, if you will, that really is why com became popular. But what's interesting is the United States has its own country code domain too, .us, but it's not nearly as popular as com. Whereas in some countries like Germany and the UK, if you travel someplace in Europe, you won't see .com, or you'll hardly see it. You'll see their country code domains. I think it has to do when those countries really got online, if you will, and if at the time they started with these country code domains, or if, like in the United States case, it was really we started with .com. So, um, And as far as why reasons companies want that when they go global, it's kind of the de facto standard at this point because of that legacy. There's nothing that makes com inherently better than net. In fact, they're both, the technology is run by the same company for both of those. But it's just, because it's in our psyche, we typically type .com at the end. That's what makes it popular.
And one of my pet peeves, and tell me if this used to be needed, but when people go, I ask, "What's your website?" and they'll go, "www." Dot. And they're like, "Okay, all right, I don't need the www." Did that was that needed back long ago when you did
Uh,
have to actually put it in?
Again, I think that gets back to kind of just the way people used it. I mean, technically, www is a subdomain of your domain name. So the domain name that you use, for example, I used dnw.com. DNW is a second level domain. Com is what we call a top level domain. www would be a subdomain or a third level domain. And so people just kind of created their websites on those. What's interesting is, well, there are two things interesting about that. One is that in some countries, it's still like in China, a lot of major companies, unless you type www, it doesn't resolve, which is
Whoa.
crazy to me. I just don't don't get it. I have a person who writes for me on my site who covers China, and every time I like say, hey, this domain you wrote about doesn't resolve, and he's like, type www, and after like 10 times, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I got to remember that in China. The other thing is about wow, it's been 6, 7 years ago now, all these new top level domains came out. So you probably see names ending in say XYZ or .money or something along
Yeah.
those lines. And when that started, when those first came out, and still today, people sometimes see those and they don't realize it's a domain name. So a lot of times the owners of those domains will say it's, they'll advertise as www.something.xyz just to show to people that it is a web address, but the www isn't necessary in those cases.
Okay. Okay, that's a good point. I haven't seen the XYZ. I've seen the dot money, dot all that stuff. And then
Yeah.
IO, I feel like has been gaining a ton of
Yeah.
popularity.
IO is actually, interestingly, a country code domain. It stands for the Indian Ocean Territory. So a lot of these, like you've probably seen .co as
Yeah.
well. That's technically for Colombia, but they basically commercialized it so anyone can use it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's so interesting because I
Yeah,
know now .org. Now, not everybody can everybody buy a .org, or is it
anyone can get a .org, but traditionally it's been used kind of like by the nonprofits. But that's something you should know if you go to a .org and it looks like a legitimate charity. Just because it's on .org, that doesn't mean it's legitimate.
okay? Same with isn't the same with .edu. You have to be a proven school to buy edu, correct?
EDU, you have to be an accredited university, and I'm trying to think if that's international or that's US.
Mm,
Because like you'll even see a .mil, which is military, and that's specific to the US.
gosh.
So yeah, it's people say, how can you write so much about domain names? Because I write several things a day. I'm like, you'd be surprised at how many interesting aspects there are to domain names.
It's vast, and see, like I'm thinking of all these questions I've had in my head forever now, Andrew, that I get to ask because
Sure.
I think I would assume people listening in would have the same question about this too. If I go and buy a domain from GoDaddy, does GoDaddy own all the domains in the world? No. So what's happening? So tell me, because I don't even know how to explain this. So I go and buy a domain from GoDaddy or Google Domains or wherever. Who owns all these domains that are in the history of the world right now? What does that whole process look like? Who's getting
Right.
that money?
So GoDaddy is the retailer. So think of them as the Walmart or the Target. And let's say they're selling let's say you go to Walmart or let's say you go to Target and you buy a Dyson vacuum, right? So Dyson is the wholesaler there, right? They manufacture it, sell it to Target, and then Target sells it to you. Well, there's a similar system with domain names. And so GoDaddy is what we call a registrar. And then the wholesaler that in your parlance there owns all of these names, if you will, is the registry. So registry and registrar. And in the case of .com and .net, that's a company called VeriSign. It's a publicly traded company, wildly profitable. Um, and so when you go to GoDaddy and you say, I want to buy this domain, I want to register this domain, they basically ping VeriSign and say, is this available? and then they tell you yes or no. And then if you register it, GoDaddy pays VeriSign to actually reserve it for them. So they just raised their prices. They charge GoDaddy a little over $8 per year for that .com domain name. And then GoDaddy passes on additional fees to you for their marketing expenses, their overhead, tech support, profit, all of that stuff. And so you'll find, like right now, if you go to different domain name registrars, their prices start around now about $9 a year, but some of them charge a lot more. So.
So knowing that the cost is for anybody $8, it sounds like though.
Yeah, the wholesale cost, and it was $7.85. They just raised it 7%. I think it's like $8.29. And then a registrar has to pay this overseeing body another 18 cents, this group called ICANN. So really basically their minimum is $8.50 per year on these domain names. And so then, if you're paying $10, that extra $1.50 goes to all that overhead and then a little bit of profit for the registrar. Now, some places charge $30 a year, right? And so they're really kind of fleecing their customers and keeping a lot of that as profit.
Oh my goodness. So how do I get into the game of being where GoDaddy buys the domain from? How did they get the right to have all of those? And can anybody ever compete with them, or they literally own that market forever?
Well, so VeriSign, the registry, kind of owns that market really in perpetuity. GoDaddy, though, there are lots of competitors to GoDaddy, right? There's Namecheap, there's Gandhi, there's one called Pork Bun that's become popular. sav.com has really low prices. Um, and so you can create a registrar that then has the ability to get these domains at wholesale from VeriSign. And I mentioned VeriSign, they run com and net, but these other extensions are run by a bunch of different companies now. And so there's a company actually in the Seattle area that has 300 or 400 of these extensions. Most of them of these top level domains, most of them are these new top level domains that came out starting around 2014. But they also run .info and .io, right? And so they play that same role that VeriSign plays for com and net for these other extensions. But the nice thing is, as a consumer, you just have to know GoDaddy or Namecheap or one of these other companies. Go to them; they take care of all that technical stuff and registering the domain, reserving it through the registry for you.
What a crazy world. I did not know that's how that
It
worked. I
is.
knew GoDaddy didn't own them, but I didn't know I didn't, it was kind of an unknown. Like I just order and just it's happening. So I just
Right.
know that's
Which
it's
is good, right? I mean, that's part of the point, and then it's some of us who get into the weeds actually are looking at, oh, this registry, controls this namespace and this one has this other one and what they're doing and all that sort of stuff. So
So how many, is there a number for how many average domains are bought every day? Is there like or even how many are out there in existence?
yeah, so out there now, the latest number, it's 350 to 400 million names out there. I forgot the exact number. .com itself is over 150 million of those.
Wow. It's over
So
half.
that's the biggest. .cn, China's is pretty big. And then there are a lot of others. Germany's is, I think, 16, 17 million now. That's one of the most successful country code domain names out there.
Hmm.
But yeah, there are a lot of domain names out there for sure. And so every quarter these days it's been over 10 million common net combined names registered every quarter. Now, of course, a lot are expiring, right? So that means the total number of domains out there might increase by a million or 2 million comms and nets total per quarter, even though 10, 11 million are being registered. So it's there are a lot of names expiring, which is a whole different market, and then there are people registering new domain names. So yeah, it's a really fascinating industry.
So obviously I know people can make money off of buying and selling domains because I've seen it come up before where I'll be interested in a name and I'll look at it and it'll say, oh, it's available, but it's $3,000, $2,000. Would you like us to help you get it, like through GoDaddy or something? And it happened one time when a client needed a website, and I said, hey, it was a dog groomer, and they needed a website, didn't have a domain, and I found it. The person was selling it for $300, and I was like, all right, that's really not that not that bad. It wasn't obviously not a common name. And so I reached out to him and told him I was interested in the domain. And in my head, I was like, they're really not going to make that much money off of it because I saw that they'd had it for like 10 years. So
Mhm.
they had all that expense of having the domain. So I offered them, I said, would you take, I think I really lowballed them, like $50. And then they said, no, no, we're not taking it. And I said, just so you know, you're probably not going to sell this because who else has this name of this company? And they finally said, we'll take 60. And I was like, okay. So I bought this domain for $60. And in my head, I'm like, they literally, I feel like lost money.
It's very rare that you can get a name that's been registered by someone else for $60. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty unique situation. Really, the median price that most of these names sell for, we've talked about these expensive domains, but the median price is about $1,000 to $5,000. And if you think about it, even as a small business, this is like your storefront, right? And so even if you don't sell online, this is your home on the web. And obviously you're planning on being in business for years. So, if you think about the cost, let's say it's $5,000, that's about $1,000 a year. That's less than $100 a month that you're really spending. Yeah, you're paying it up front, but and how much are you spending on other stuff? If you're a plumber, an ad in a newspaper, what does that cost still? I mean, people still
Yeah,
advertise that way, believe that or not. But that's that might be $1,000, right? And then your Yelp, if you're advertising on Yelp, you're spending hundreds of dollars on there every month. Google ads, that sort of thing. So really, if you think about it, once you get over the sticker shock, a lot of people are like, oh, but I can just register a new domain for $10 versus getting this perfect one for $3,000. So that's kind of the tricky thing for people to get over. But I think if you look at the long run, um, of having a nice simple domain name that's easy to spell, easy to remember, and the benefits that will give you, spending a few $1,000s in a domain to get started, even as a small business, makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
And also a trend we're seeing now is that the domain sellers will oftentimes offer you a domain on a payment plan. So you might be able to pay that off over 2 years, and then it gets that cost down to something similar to what you're paying for you know Google Ads or Yelp every month.
sure. And I do agree because I can't stand when and I get it. Again, $10 versus $1,000, but people go to have their name and they'll be like, I'm from Alaska. I moved to Florida, 4 years ago, but Alaska, the AK. If it's not available, just put AK after it, and I'll get the
Yeah.
.com.
Yeah.
And so it's like, and that's I feel like in Alaska everybody knows that, so they'll go to like see it and they go, oh, this is them because it has
Right.
AK at the end of it. But man, it just looks so clean, so professional to
Right.
have yourname.com. It just and then your email, you can Andrew at this.com. It just
Right.
looks so good. But yeah, it's expensive. It's funny you said that even the price of $3,000. I had a friend that was starting a business earlier this year, and they had found their domain for the business name they just settled on, and they're like, "Okay, it's for sale online for 3,000." And I was like, "Oh, dang, that stinks." So I said, "Well, let's maybe think about changing the name or adding something after it." And within like a minute, he goes, "Nope, I just went ahead and bought it." I was
Yeah.
like, "You just dropped $3,000 just like that?" He goes, I want my domain name. Like I want that name."
Right.
So now he has it.
It,
So
and when you see a name out there for a few grand, you should be thankful it's not 100 grand. Because I've have friends who have bought names that are no better than the ones that you might pay 3 grand for, but each one's unique, and they maybe paid 50 grand or 80 grand just because that's what the seller you know requested, and that's where they settled. So, but a good domain name can give you credibility just by itself, right? And so I always encourage. I see a lot of contractors and people that they have a domain name, and then for email they're using Gmail or even AOL or something like that. And it's like, it's super simple to set up email with your domain name, and then you have a professional persona, on your business card, right? It doesn't look, I'm not going to out this person, but I got a business card from a painter here, and well, he doesn't have a web address on there, but his email, yeah, it's one of those free services right here, and so it's like, well, I mean, yeah, it's a painter, and most people in those trades are, that's fairly common. But imagine how you can stick out. There's another company I'm going to call to give me a quote on painting, and they've got a catchy name. It's professional. They have a website there where I can see testimonials and that sort of stuff. So I that matters. It really does matter. It can be hard to calculate, but it really does matter.
All right, I hope everybody's paying attention because everything Andrew's saying, I 100% agree with that. Because I've seen it so many times. They'll have a good domain, but their email is a Andrew at gmail.com. You're just like, oh man. Or like one from their high school. I feel like, oh, you had this in high school. I know it is, ladiesman at gmail.com or something. Like, goodness. And
It's funny actually with podcastguests.com even I have one person who's on there and when he gets an invitation from a podcast, one of the things he looks at, he's like, look, I it sounds like an interesting podcast, but they don't have a domain name associated with their podcast or a professional email. So,
mm,
he's like, I hesitate, right? Why is this person using Hotmail if they're taking their podcast seriously? And it's something that a lot of people overlook, right? I would say the majority of podcasts that, invite people through the system don't have a professional email address. Um, and, something I've been thinking about writing and telling people, hey, it's not, a lot of people think, oh, it's hard to get an email address. It's super simple. You can do it with Google, right? You can connect
yeah.
it to Google and get it in Gmail and pull it in with your other email that you're from your whoever provides your internet, that sort of thing. And it's a lot easier now than it used to be.
Mm, so good. So if we kind of wrap it up and close it out, if you were to give any business owner, school, anybody listening right now, three takeaways from today on talking about, I mean, it could be in podcasting, it could be in domains. What would be
Sure.
those three things that really people should take home today that they should do?
So I'd say on a domain name, get a professional name. Be willing to spend. Just because the name is taken doesn't mean you can't get it, and it can be fairly inexpensive. And by fairly inexpensive, I mean under $5,000. A lot of times, even $1,000 to get the right name for your business. Second would be use professional email. And you can do that once you get the domain name, right? You automatically have a professional email address. And the third thing I'd say is, we haven't talked about podcasts much, but is getting on podcasts is a great way to grow your business. And I have a guide on how to do that. It's at podcastguests.com/guide, free guide. You don't even have to give me your email address, but it walks you through the steps of preparing for pitching to and getting booked on podcasts and getting the most out of it.
Fantastic. So thank you. Of course, I have one question that just popped in my head.
Sure.
So this is like a legal question, so I don't know if you'd be allowed to answer it. But I came across just earlier this week somebody who had a name for a podcast because I was thinking about, oh, what if I ever start another podcast? I could do this name, and I saw that somebody had done a similar name to it,
Mhm.
uh, but it only had 3 episodes from years ago, and they never did anything with it. But the domain was available, and so I was
Mm.
like, okay, if I buy the domain, is there any like again, this is more of a legal question, but like, oh, he has a domain though, and now launched the podcast with owning that domain. Is there any like because that person launched a one? It's not even in iTunes, like it's on their website, and they call it
Right.
the something podcast. And I didn't know if there's any. Since you're into domains, is there any legality for like, oh, if you own that domain, you kind of own that name for the most part?
Right. So I'm not sure about that, but I do know kind of the legal side around domain names and what we call cyber squatting. And there in the United States, well, worldwide, when you register most domain extensions, so it excludes some of the country code domains, you're agreeing to this arbitration mechanism that says if someone thinks that you're cyber squatting with the name, they can file this dispute and you can respond, and it's fairly inexpensive and fairly quick. They have to prove several things in order to take that domain away from you. So that's the side I know.
Hmm.
They have to prove that first of all, it's identical or confusingly similar to something that they have trademark rights in, right? So if you've launched one episode of a podcast, um, it's hard to argue that you necessarily have trademark rights in that unless you've gotten a lot of publicity, right, in the name of that. But if you've filed and been approved for a trademark, or if you can prove to them that you're known, pretty much or well known, right? So you have common law trademarks.
Okay.
You can get that. Then you have to show that the person who owns it doesn't have rights or legitimate interests in it.
Jeez.
So if that person has a reason for owning it, right? They didn't just register it because they're like, oh, I want a cyber squad on this name to sell it to this company that's filing this complaint. Then you have to prove that. And then the third thing is that they registered it. and used it in bad faith. And so
Mhm.
here's where, like, if someone registered a domain 10 years ago and you start a brand around it this year, you're not going to be able to prove that because they didn't register it to go after your brand, which didn't exist at the time. So that's a common mistake. I think common mistake I see a lot of entrepreneurs make. They're like, oh, I'll just brand around this name and then I can go get the name because I'll have a trademark. Doesn't work that way. If the domain came first, if the person owned that domain first, you can't go claim that domain based on a trademark that you gained later on.
Okay, good to know. All right, no, good info. I
Yeah,
don't ever want to step on people's toes or do anything that's gonna
right.
get me in trouble. So I was like, I don't even know how that world works. So I was gonna talk to.
Yeah. Talk to an attorney, especially on the podcast side. I see a lot of bad advice online where people are confusing trademarks and copyrights. And, I chime in to say, I know this is wrong, but I'm not going to give you the right answer because I'm not a lawyer and you should talk to a
Sure.
lawyer. It's kind of what I tell them. So,
And one of the guests I got from, I'm pretty sure I got them from podcast guests, was a trademark copyright lawyer that we had a really good talk, and
oh,
I learned a lot about that. So I was going to reach out to her, and I was like, "Hey,
yeah. Who is that?
oh, of course you had to ask me that,
Yeah,
Robert.
I won't butcher
Lordy,
it.
she's out of California though. She
Okay.
was in Los Angeles, I believe.
Oh,
Los
good.
Angeles, San
Good.
Diego.
Yeah, reach out to them. So,
Okay. Good deal. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to hop on the podcast. I learned way more than I thought I was going to learn today because I thought we were going to talk podcasting, and then this whole domain world opened up, and I loved it. So thank you very much.
yeah, you bet. My pleasure.
Well, I bet you got done with today's episode and you're like, wow, I learned a ton about domains that I didn't think I needed to know or wanted to know, but now I know. And that's how I felt at the end. I know more about domains than I probably need to know, but I'm not complaining because I love learning new things and that world is just super, super interesting to me. So I hope if you guys don't have a .com yet, you can try and find one of the ones that will work for your business name or for whatever you got going on. So if you find it, buy .com and you'll be in good shape. So huge shout out to Andrew. Thank you, sir. And thanks for teaching me. And we'll be here next week with another awesome guest on the Finally Marketing Networks podcast. We'll see you then.